Hollywood lied to you. For decades, the movies, the history books, and the newsreels painted a picture of D-Day that was monochromatic. When you close your eyes and imagine Omaha Beach, you see Tom Hanks. You see waves of white soldiers storming the gray sands of Normandy to save the world from tyranny. You see a narrative that is heroic, bloody, and inspiring, but it is also incomplete. It is a whitewashed memory that deliberately erased the faces of nearly 2,000 men who were there, in the blood and the fire, fighting and dying for a country that forced them to sit at the back of the bus. They said black men lacked the courage for modern combat. They said they would panic under fire. They said they were only good for driving trucks or digging ditches behind the lines. Yet, on the morning of June 6, 1944, when the ramp of the landing craft dropped into the freezing hell of the English Channel, black soldiers from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion were standing shoulder to shoulder with the infantry, stepping directly into the kill zone. Before we descend into the madness of that morning, I want you to pause. Ask yourself, in all the movies you've watched, in all the classes you've sat through, did you ever see a black soldier on Omaha Beach? If this is the first time you're hearing about the 320th and their sacrifice, I want you to write "first time" in the comments below. Let's see just how deep this erasure really goes. Because what you are about to hear is not fiction. It is the recovered memory of a group of men who were given one of the most dangerous, unusual, and critical missions of the entire invasion. They weren't just targets, they were walking bullseyes. And their story changes everything we think we know about the longest day. Imagine the dawn of June 6, 1944. The sky is a low, oppressive gray, merging with the churning, angry waters of the channel. The air is filled with a noise so loud it ceases to be sound and becomes a physical pressure against the skin. The roar of naval guns, the scream of aircraft engines, the rhythmic thud of explosions. The Allied invasion fleet, the greatest armada the world has ever seen, is poised to strike at the heart of Hitler's fortress Europe. The target is the Atlantic Wall, a seamless line of concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions that the Nazis have spent 4 years perfecting. They have flooded the fields behind the beaches to drown paratroopers. They have mined the sands to eviscerate infantry. And they have planted Rommel's asparagus, wooden poles tipped with explosives, in the shallows to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. The first wave of the invasion is the suicide wave. Everyone knows it. The men in the Higgins boats are vomiting from seasickness and terror, gripping their M1 Garands with knuckles white as bone. Among these men, scattered across the assault waves, are the soldiers of the 320th. They look different from the infantry. Yes, they carry rifles, but they also carry something else. Winches, cables, gas cylinders, and massive, uninflated rubber bags that look like the skins of dead whales. These are barrage balloons. Their mission is bizarre but vital. They must land on the beach, amidst the mortar fire and the machine guns, inflate these hydrogen-filled balloons, and winch them up to an altitude of 2,000 feet. The purpose was to create an aerial minefield. Any German fighter plane trying to strafe the beaches, flying low to machine gun the trapped American soldiers, would snag a wing on the steel cables tethering the balloons. The cable would shear the wing off or drag a small explosive charge up to the plane, blowing it out of the sky. It was a purely defensive weapon, a shield made of rubber and steel wire to protect the vulnerable infantry and the ships off the coast. But for the men of the 320th, operating these balloons meant making themselves the most visible targets on the entire beach. An infantryman could dig a foxhole. He could hide behind a tank trap. He could make himself small. You cannot hide a silvery, 40-foot-long hydrogen balloon. You cannot hide the winch truck. To do their job, the men of the 320th had to stand their ground, exposed and vulnerable, while the Luftwaffe and the German artillery spotters zeroed in on them. And who were these men entrusted with such a suicidal task? They were the descendants of slaves and sharecroppers. They were men from Harlem, from the Deep South, from the industrial Midwest. They were men like Waverly Woodson, a pre-med student from Philadelphia, who had enlisted hoping to become an officer, only to be told that the Army didn't want black officers in combat roles. He became a medic instead, a healer in a unit designed to be blown apart. Woodson is the heartbeat of this story. On the morning of June 6th, he wasn't just a soldier, he was a walking casualty before he even touched the sand. As his landing craft tank, LCT, approached the beach, it hit a German mine. The explosion was catastrophic. It tore through the hull, shredding metal and flesh. The concussive force slammed Woodson against the steel bulkhead, searing his back with shrapnel and possibly rupturing his internal organs. He was in agony, bleeding, his lower body numb. The ship was sinking, the water was rising, and the air was filled with the screams of dying men. A lesser man would have stayed down. A lesser man would have waited for rescue. But Waverly Woodson was part of a generation that had to fight for the right to fight. He pulled himself up. He checked his medical kit. And as the ramp went down into the blood-red surf of Omaha Beach, he didn't retreat. He advanced. This was the reality of the 320th. They were fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. In front of them were the Nazis, the embodiment of a racist ideology that viewed them as subhuman. Behind them was the United States Army, an institution that was rigidly segregated, that treated German prisoners of war better than its own black troops. In the training camps in Tennessee and Georgia, the men of the 320th had been called niggers by local sheriffs and even by their own white officers. They had been forced to eat in separate mess halls, sleep in separate barracks, and sit in the back of the camp movie theaters. They had been assaulted for wearing their uniforms in town. And yet, here they were, half a world away from home, preparing to die for a concept of liberty that they had never fully experienced themselves. The Germans had a name for the American forces. They expected them to be soft, diverse, undisciplined. But when they looked through their binoculars from the bunkers of Omaha Beach, they saw something they didn't expect. They saw black men unloading gear under fire. They saw balloons rising into the smoke-choked sky, defiant silver spheres floating above the carnage. The presence of the 320th was a shock to the German defenders, but it was also a shock to the white American soldiers fighting beside them. Many of these white boys from Kansas or Alabama had never seen a black person in a position of responsibility, let alone combat. They had been told that black units would break and run. Instead, as the machine gun fire from the MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaws, tore through the ranks, they saw the men of the 320th holding the line. They saw them rushing into the surf to pull drowning white soldiers to safety. They saw them setting up their winches while mortar shells exploded yards away. The erasure of this story is not accidental. It is a crime of history. After the war, the Army conducted a study on the performance of black troops. The report was glowing. It detailed their courage, their efficiency, their vital contribution to the victory in Europe. But that report was buried. The newsreels focused on the white faces. The medals were handed out to the white heroes. Waverly Woodson, who we will see perform miracles on that beach, was nominated for the Medal of Honor. But the paperwork mysteriously vanished. It would take nearly 80 years for the truth to begin to surface. But today, we are digging it up. We are going back to that beach. We are going to walk in the footsteps of the 320th. We are going to feel the weight of the balloons, the sting of the salt spray, and the terror of the German 88s raining down. We are going to witness the moment when the invisible soldiers became the most visible heroes of D-Day. They were the only black combat unit to storm the beaches on the first day of the invasion. Their mission was defensive, but their actions were offensive in the extreme. They attacked the very notion of white supremacy with every step they took on French soil. As the landing craft lurches toward the shore, carrying Waverly Woodson and his brothers in arms, the question isn't whether they are ready for D-Day. The question is whether D-Day is ready for them. The ramp is dropping, the water is waiting, and the 320th is about to make history, whether the world wants to watch or not. The ramp of the LCT slammed down into the surf, and the world dissolved into red noise. There is no training that can prepare a human mind for the sensory overload of Omaha Beach at high tide on June 6th. It was not a battle. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. The Germans had spent years calculating the exact angles of fire, ensuring that every grain of sand on that beach was covered by a machine gun or a mortar. As the men of the 320th surged forward into the waist-deep water, they stepped into a crossfire so intense it shredded the air itself. The water around the landing craft didn't just turn red, it turned a thick, opaque pink, a slurry of seawater, diesel fuel, and the blood of the waves that had gone before them. Bodies bobbed in the surf like driftwood, the dead of the 116th and the 16th Infantry Regiments, men who had been alive minutes ago, now washing against the legs of the balloon crews as they struggled toward the shore. Waverly Woodson was dying, or at least he should have been. The mine explosion that had rocked his landing craft had sent shrapnel tearing into his groin and back. The pain was a blinding, white-hot spike that radiated with every heartbeat. His uniform was soaked in his own blood. A rational man would have collapsed. A rational man would have curled into a ball in the bottom of the boat and waited for the end. But Woodson was operating on a frequency beyond rationality. As the boat listed and began to sink, he saw men, white men, floundering in the water, weighted down by their heavy packs, screaming as they drowned or were picked off by German snipers. The racial divide that defined America, the laws that said Woodson was inferior to the men drowning in front of him, evaporated in the salt spray. He didn't see white men. He saw soldiers. He saw brothers. Disregarding his own agony, Woodson plunged into the water. He grabbed a drowning soldier, hauling him toward the relative safety of the shingle, the rocky embankment at the edge of the beach that offered the only cover from the scything machine gun fire. He went back for another, and another. He was a medic, and his war had begun not with a rifle shot, but with the desperate physical act of saving life amidst an orgy of death. He finally dragged himself onto the stones of the shingle, collapsing for a moment as the world spun around him. He checked his own wounds, realized he was bleeding out, and did the only thing he could. He dressed them himself, tightened his belt to stem the flow, and stood up. There was work to do. Around him, the rest of the 320th was attempting the impossible. Imagine the absurdity, the sheer terrifying madness of their task. Infantrymen were taught to stay low, to crawl, to blend in. The men of the 320th were ordered to drag massive, silvery, hydrogen-filled balloons onto a beach that was exploding. These balloons were tethered to winches on trucks, but many of the trucks had been drowned in the channel or blown apart by artillery. So the men became the winches. They grabbed the steel cables with their bare hands, muscles straining, boots slipping in the bloody sand, manually hauling these leviathans down to the beach. A barrage balloon is not a small target. It is a signpost. It screams to the enemy, "Here we are." As the first balloons began to rise from the chaos of the beach, ascending to their operational altitude of 2,000 feet, they drew the attention of every German gunner on the bluffs. The Luftwaffe, though scarce that day, knew exactly what those balloons meant. They meant that the beachhead was being secured. They meant the airspace was being denied. To the Germans, the black soldiers wrestling with these silver whales were high-priority targets. Snipers shifted their aim from the officers to the balloon crews. Mortar teams adjusted their coordinates to drop shells on the winch positions. To operate a balloon on Omaha Beach was to stand naked in a thunderstorm holding a lightning rod. Yet, they did it. Corporal Leo Harris, a journalist in civilian life now serving with the 320th, described the scene. He saw men sprinting across the sand with gas cylinders strapped to their backs, dodging geysers of sand and flesh as artillery shells landed feet away. He saw crews frantically inflating the bags, the hiss of hydrogen mixing with the crack of rifle fire. They knew that if a tracer bullet hit the balloon while it was near the ground, the hydrogen would ignite, creating a miniature Hindenburg disaster in the middle of a crowded beach. They worked with the precision of a bomb disposal unit, but with the speed of a track team. And amidst this mechanical ballet of war, Waverly Woodson set up his aid station. He found a small patch of defilade under the shelter of the shingle, pulled out his medical kit, and began to perform miracles. The casualty rate on Omaha was catastrophic. The beach was littered with men screaming for medic and mama. Woodson was one of the few medics in his sector who was still mobile. For the next 30 hours, he would not sleep. He would not eat. He would barely sit down. The patients came in waves. Men with limbs blown off by mortar shells. Men with sucking chest wounds. Men with their intestines spilling out into their hands. Woodson treated them all. He administered plasma, sprinkled sulfa powder into gaping wounds, tied tourniquets with blood-slicked hands. He removed bullets with forceps while sand rained down on his operating theater. At one point, he was treating a white soldier whose leg had been shredded. The soldier looked up, eyes wide with shock, and saw a black face hovering over him. In Georgia or Alabama, this proximity might have been a crime. Here, on the edge of the world, it was salvation. The soldier didn't care about Jim Crow. He cared that the hands pressing down on his artery were strong, capable, and gentle. He cared that the voice telling him, "You're going to make it, soldier," was steady and calm. Woodson's own pain was a constant, screaming companion. He later admitted that he was operating in a daze, fueled by adrenaline and a profound sense of duty. He became a machine of mercy. When his supplies ran low, he crawled out onto the open beach, scavenging medical kits from the bodies of dead medics, dodging sniper fire to retrieve morphine and bandages. He pulled 3 men from a burning tank that had been hit by an 80mm shell, dragging them through the surf just before the vehicle exploded. He performed an amputation on a soldier whose foot was hanging by a thread, using only a pair of scissors and a morphine syringe, saving the man from bleeding to death. The sun began to climb higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing the full horror of the beach. And rising above that horror, like strange, defiant moons, were the balloons of the 320th. By midday, a dozen of them were floating over the beachhead. They were swaying gently in the breeze, their steel cables humming a low note in the wind. To the men pinned down on the shingle, those balloons were the first sign of order in a world of chaos. They were a visible signal that the invasion was taking root. The Germans tried to shoot them down. They dove their aircraft at the beach, trying to strafe the infantry, but the curtain of steel cables forced them up, spoiling their aim, protecting the vulnerable men below. The 320th was doing its job. They were holding the sky, but the psychological impact of their presence was just as powerful as the tactical one. For the white soldiers of the 1st and 29th Divisions, seeing black troops standing their ground, doing their job with cool efficiency while the world ended around them, shattered a lifetime of stereotypes in a single afternoon. You cannot call a man a coward when you watch him winch an explosive gas bag into the sky while mortar shells land around his boots. You cannot say a man is inferior when he is the one pulling the shrapnel out of your chest. The beach was a crucible, and in its heat, the lie of white supremacy was being burned away, at least for those who were there to see it. By the late afternoon, the tide began to turn. The infantry, spurred on by leaders who refused to die on the sand, began to crack the German defenses. They blew gaps in the wire, silenced the pillboxes, and began the slow, bloody climb up the bluffs. But the beach remained a dangerous place. Artillery from inland continued to hammer the landing zones. And Waverly Woodson kept working. He had treated nearly 200 men. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, his own and that of 100 others. His back was on fire. He was dehydrated, exhausted, and running on fumes. But every time a cry for help went up, he moved. There is a story, passed down by the survivors of the 320th, about a moment near dusk. A group of black soldiers, exhausted from hauling the balloons, were digging foxholes near the shingle. A white officer, a major from an infantry regiment, stumbled past them. He was wounded, dazed, having lost most of his men. He stopped and looked at the black troops. He looked at the balloons tethered above them. He looked at the bodies they had pulled from the surf. He didn't say a word. He just saluted. It was a small gesture, lost in the vastness of the war, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the wall. As night fell on June 6th, the fires of burning vehicles lit up the beach. The balloons glowed orange in the flickering light. Silent sentinels watching over the dead and the living. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion had landed. They had taken their casualties. They had secured their objective. And Waverly Woodson, the man who wasn't supposed to be an officer, the man who wasn't supposed to be brave enough for combat, finally sat down. He collapsed against the wheel of a wrecked truck, his medical kit empty, his duty done. But his war and the war for his memory was just beginning. Because the next day, the cameras would come, and the erasure would begin. The sun rose on D-Day +1, revealing a landscape that had been transformed from a slaughterhouse into a fortress. Omaha Beach was still a graveyard, the sand churned with debris and the dead. But looking up, the sky had changed. It was no longer empty. A forest of silver spheres hung suspended over the beachhead, hundreds of them, swaying in the Atlantic breeze. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion had done the impossible. In less than 24 hours, under constant fire, they had erected a shimmering curtain of steel and rubber that effectively closed the airspace over the invasion fleet. To the exhausted infantrymen digging into the bluffs, those balloons were more than just defensive measures. They were a roof. They were a promise that the Luftwaffe, the terrifying German Air Force that had ravaged Europe for 5 years, would not be able to dive bomb them into oblivion. The effectiveness of the 320th was immediate and undeniable. In the days following the landing, German pilots, accustomed to total air superiority, found themselves checkmated by physics. To strafe the beaches, a pilot had to fly low and fast. But the balloons, tethered by nearly invisible steel cables, created a lethal web. If a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf tried to dive through that web, the cable would shear through the wing like a hot knife through butter. Or, worse for the pilot, the cable would drag a small, contact-detonated mine up to the aircraft, blowing it out of the sky. The Germans were forced to fly high, above the balloon ceiling, where they were inaccurate and vulnerable to Allied anti-aircraft guns. The men of the 320th hadn't just inflated balloons. They had mined the sky. But as the invasion force pushed inland, leaving the beaches behind, and entering the claustrophobic hell of the Normandy hedgerows, the men of the 320th faced a new kind of reality. They were moving from the black and white clarity of combat, where the only objective is survival, back into the gray, murky waters of American racism. They were liberators, yes. They were heroes, undoubtedly. But to the United States Army, they were still a problem to be managed, a colored unit that needed to be kept separate from the real soldiers. The contrast was jarring. As the 320th moved through the liberated French villages, towns like Isigny and Carentan, they were greeted with a warmth that shocked them. The French civilians, emerging from their cellars and ruined homes, did not see the color of their skin. They saw the uniform. They saw the men who had driven the Nazis out. Old French women would rush up to hug them, pressing bottles of wine and wheels of cheese into their hands. Children would run alongside their trucks, shouting, "Vive l'Amérique!" For many of the black soldiers, men who had grown up in the Deep South, where a black man could be lynched for making eye contact with a white woman, this reception was disorienting. In France, they were treated like men. In France, they were treated like saviors. There is a story, often retold by veterans of the unit, of a French child reaching out to touch the skin of a soldier from the 320th, then looking at his own hand to see if the black came off. It wasn't an act of malice. It was innocent curiosity. In that moment, the soldier realized that to these people, his blackness was not a badge of shame or a reason for hatred. It was just a detail. But then, the moment would be shattered by the arrival of a white military police officer, barking orders, telling the black troops to move along, to stay out of the white bars, to remember their place. The soldiers of the 320th found themselves in the surreal position of being more free in a foreign land they had just conquered than they were in the army they served. Waverly Woodson, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. After 30 hours of continuous, superhuman effort on the beach, he had finally collapsed. He was evacuated to a hospital ship lying offshore, his wounds finally catching up to him. The doctors who treated him were amazed he was still standing. He was diagnosed with a groin injury, extensive back wounds, and pneumonia. They transferred him to a hospital in England to recover. By all rights, his war should have been over. He had done his duty. He had saved countless lives. He had earned a ticket home. But Woodson wasn't done. As he lay in the hospital bed in England, listening to the reports of the fighting in France, he felt a pull that was stronger than his pain. His unit was still there. His brothers were still dodging mortar fire and wrestling balloons in the mud. He requested, demanded, to be discharged from the hospital. The doctors refused. He kept asking. Finally, barely healed, still in pain, he managed to get himself released and put on a transport back to Normandy. He rejoined the 320th, not because he loved the war, but because he loved the men he fought with. This is the definition of the brotherhood of combat, a bond that transcends race, politics, and self-preservation. Back in Normandy, the war had ground down into a brutal attrition. The hedgerows, ancient earthen banks topped with thick, tangled bushes, turned every field into a fortress. The 320th was right in the thick of it. They weren't just rear echelon troops. Their balloons were needed to protect the forward artillery positions and supply dumps that were constantly moving up. This meant the men of the 320th were digging foxholes alongside the infantry, eating the same cold K rations, and dying under the same artillery barrages. Yet, the segregation persisted. The army went to absurd lengths to maintain the color line. Black units had separate postal services, separate recreational areas, and even separate blood banks. The blood of a black soldier, according to the twisted science of the American military, could not be given to a white soldier, even if that white soldier was bleeding to death. It was a policy that defied logic and humanity, especially to men like Woodson, who had treated white soldiers on the beach with his own blood-soaked hands. The hypocrisy was a constant, low-level hum in the background of the war, a reminder that they were fighting two enemies, the Nazis in front of them and the Jim Crow policies behind them. But something was happening in the crucible of combat. The bullets didn't care about segregation. The shrapnel didn't check for a race card. As the 320th performed their duties with quiet, professional excellence, the attitudes of the white soldiers who fought near them began to shift. It wasn't a sudden, universal enlightenment, but it was a crack in the foundation. A white artillery crew, whose position had just been saved from a dive bomber by a 320th balloon, didn't look at the balloon crew with contempt. They looked at them with gratitude. They shared cigarettes. They swapped stories. In the mud of Normandy, a temporary, fragile equality was being forged, not by laws or protests, but by the shared reality of survival. However, the official record was already being sanitized. The newsreel crews that arrived in Normandy in the weeks after D-Day were given specific instructions. They were told to focus on the fighting men, which, in the eyes of the War Department, meant white infantry. The black troops, even those in combat support roles like the 320th, were filmed mostly loading trucks or cooking food. The image of the black combat soldier was being systematically erased from the visual history of the war in real time. The heroic actions of men like Woodson were recorded in unit diaries and witness statements, but they didn't make the front pages of the New York Times or the hometown papers in white America. While Woodson was back with his unit, a piece of paper began to circulate through the chain of command. It was a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. His commanding officer, having interviewed the men Woodson saved and the doctors who treated him, wrote up a citation detailing his extraordinary heroism on Omaha Beach. The recommendation described how he braved intense fire to save drowning men, how he treated over 200 casualties while wounded himself, how he refused to stop until he collapsed. It was a slam dunk case. In any other army, or for a soldier of any other color, the medal would have been a guarantee. But the paper trail for a black hero is a fragile thing in a segregated army. The recommendation was sent up the ladder. It reached the office of General John C. H. Lee. It reached the desk of General Omar Bradley. And then it vanished. A note was found later, a memo from the War Department, stating that the recommendation was not sufficient for the Medal of Honor, suggesting instead a Distinguished Service Cross. But even that didn't happen immediately. The paperwork was lost. The eyewitness accounts were misplaced. It was a bureaucratic lynching of a hero's legacy. Instead of the Medal of Honor, the 320th as a unit received a commendation. Woodson eventually received a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Honorable awards, yes, but woefully inadequate for what he had done. It was a pattern that would repeat itself for every black soldier who performed acts of extreme valor in World War II. Not a single Medal of Honor was awarded to a black soldier during the war. Not one. It would take 50 years for the government to admit that this was not an accident, but a policy of exclusion. As the summer of 1944 turned to autumn, and the Allied armies raced toward the German border, the men of the 320th continued to do their job. They hauled their balloons through the mud of Belgium and the snow of the Ardennes. They endured the V-1 buzz bombs in Antwerp. They were the silent guardians of the sky, always present, always watching. But the men themselves were beginning to change. They had seen the world. They had killed men. They had saved men. They had tasted the freedom of France and the bitterness of American racism in the same breath. They were no longer the same men who had been drafted from the cotton fields and the ghettos. They were warriors, and they were beginning to ask a dangerous question. If we can fight for freedom in Europe, why can't we fight for it at home? The seeds of the civil rights movement were not just sown in the churches of Alabama or the courts of Washington. They were sown in the foxholes of Normandy by men like Waverly Woodson, who looked at the American flag flying over a liberated French town and wondered when it would fly over a liberated America. The war in Europe was entering its final bloody phase, but the war for the soul of the 320th and for the soul of the nation they served was just heating up. And soon they would face the ultimate test of their loyalty, coming home, May 8th, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. The guns that had torn the continent apart for 6 years finally fell silent. In the streets of London, Paris, and New York, the celebrations were raucous, a release of tension that had gripped the world. People danced in the streets, kissed strangers, and wept with relief. The Nazi monster had been slain. For the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the news came with a profound sense of accomplishment. They had done what they set out to do. They had landed on the beaches of hell, held the sky against the Luftwaffe, and marched across Europe as liberators. They packed up their silver balloons for the last time, deflating the giant rubber whales that had been their constant companions. They wound up the steel cables, stowed the winches, and prepared for the journey back across the Atlantic. But as the troop ships chugged westward, leaving the ruins of Europe behind, a different kind of tension began to settle over the black soldiers. On the way over, they had been untested recruits sailing into the unknown. On the way back, they were combat veterans, men who had seen the worst of humanity and survived. They had walked tall in France. They had dated French women, drunk in French bars, and been treated with a dignity that was intoxicating. Now, they were returning to the land of the free, and they carried a silent, burning question in their hearts. Would America be different? Had their blood purchased their equality? Or were they returning to the same back-of-the-bus, second-class existence they had left behind? The answer came the moment the ships docked. There were parades, yes. Ticker tape rained down on Fifth Avenue. But the moment the parades ended, the partition slammed back down. The white units were demobilized into a society that hailed them as the greatest generation. They were given easy access to loans, to housing in the booming suburbs, to high-paying jobs. The black units, including the heroes of the 320th, were demobilized into a society that was actively hostile to their presence. The reception was not just cold, it was often violent. In the South, black veterans returning in uniform were seen as a threat. A black man in a military uniform, walking with the confidence of a combat veteran, was a direct challenge to the racial hierarchy of Jim Crow. There were incidents, too many to count, of veterans being beaten, arrested, or even lynched simply for wearing the uniform of the United States Army. The message was brutal and clear. You may have defeated Hitler, but you have not defeated us. For Waverly Woodson, the return home was a slow-motion tragedy. He returned to Philadelphia a hero in his own community, but a ghost to the wider world. He carried the physical scars of the shrapnel in his back and groin, and the invisible scars of the trauma he had witnessed. But he also carried a dream. Before the war, he had been a pre-med student. On Omaha Beach, he had proven he had the hands, the mind, and the soul of a healer. He wanted to finish his education. He wanted to become a doctor. He had saved lives in the worst conditions imaginable. Surely, he was qualified to save lives in a hospital. He applied to medical schools, but the doors that should have swung open were bolted shut. The quota systems of the time, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism of admissions boards, kept him out. And then there was the betrayal of the GI Bill. On paper, the GI Bill of Rights was a colorblind piece of legislation, offering tuition and low-interest mortgages to all veterans. In practice, it was one of the greatest engines of racial inequality in American history. The administration of the bill was left to local officials, and in state after state, black veterans were denied the benefits their white counterparts received. They were steered toward vocational training instead of universities. They were denied home loans in white neighborhoods. Woodson, the hero of Omaha Beach, the man who should have been the pride of American medicine, eventually found work in a morgue. It is a bitter, poetic injustice. The hands that had pulled the living from the surf of Normandy ended up tending to the dead in Philadelphia. He built a good life, a quiet life, raised a family, and served his community. But the potential of what he could have been, what America lost by denying him his dream, is a tragedy that echoes through generations. And then, the erasure began in earnest. As the 1940s turned into the 1950s, America began to tell itself the story of the war. It was a story told in movies, in novels, and in history textbooks. And in this story, the black soldier simply did not exist. The most famous retelling, the 1962 epic film The Longest Day, purported to be a definitive recreation of D-Day. It featured a cast of thousands, stars like John Wayne and Henry Fonda. It showed the beaches, the cliffs, the paratroopers, but if you watch that movie today, you will look in vain for a single barrage balloon winch. You will look in vain for a single black face on Omaha Beach. For the veterans of the 320th, watching this cultural amnesia unfold was a psychological assault. Imagine turning on the television and seeing a version of the most important day of your life, a day where you bled and watched your friends die, and seeing yourself completely scrubbed from the frame. It was as if they had never been there. It was a form of gaslighting on a national scale. They were told, implicitly and explicitly, that their sacrifice didn't count. That D-Day was a white victory, won by white men for a white nation. But there is a twist to this tragedy. The erasure didn't break them. It radicalized them. The men of the 320th and the thousands of other black veterans who returned from the war did not go quietly back into the shadows. They had looked the Nazi war machine in the eye and survived. They were not going to be intimidated by a sheriff in Alabama or a bus driver in Mississippi. The Double V campaign, victory abroad, victory at home, morphed into the civil rights movement. Medgar Evers was a veteran who stormed Normandy. Hosea Williams, a lieutenant under Martin Luther King Jr., was a veteran who was wounded in Germany. Amzie Moore, a key organizer in Mississippi, was a veteran. These men returned with a new sense of agency. They had learned organization, discipline, and logistics in the Army. They had learned how to fight. And when they came home, they applied those lessons to the war against segregation. The 320th didn't just bring back barrage balloons. They brought back the spirit of resistance. When you look at the photos of the early civil rights marches, look closely at the men. Look at how they stand. Look at their discipline. That is the posture of soldiers. That is the legacy of the 320th. They realized that if America wouldn't give them the freedom they had fought for, they would have to take it. One of the most poignant stories of this era involves a train ride, a common setting for the humiliations of the time. A group of black veterans, some from the 320th, were traveling south by train. They were in uniform, medals on their chests. The train stopped at a station to pick up more passengers. A group of German prisoners of war, being transported to a detention camp, were also on the platform. The train's conductor led the German prisoners into the dining car so they could eat. The black veterans, men who had risked their lives to capture those very Germans, were told they had to buy their food through a window and eat it on the platform in the sweltering heat. They watched through the glass as the enemy sat at tables, laughing, being served by American waiters. It was moments like this, moments of absolute, crystalline absurdity, that forged the steel of the civil rights movement. It stripped away any lingering illusion that the system could be reformed by politeness or patience. The veterans knew the score. The enemy wasn't just across the ocean. The enemy was the law itself. Waverly Woodson never stopped fighting for recognition, though he did it quietly. He kept his records. He told his story to his family. He refused to let the truth die in his own house, even if the world outside ignored it. He died in 2005, still without the Medal of Honor he had been recommended for in 1944. He died knowing what he had done, but arguably wondering if his country would ever care. But history is a funny thing. It can be buried, but it rarely stays dead. The balloons of the 320th may have been packed away in 1945, but the memory of them remained, tethered to the truth by a cable that could not be cut. As the 20th century ended and a new century began, a new generation of historians, journalists, and activists began to ask questions. They looked at the photos of D-Day and noticed the balloons. They asked, who flew those? They dug into the archives. They found the lost records. They found the 320th. And what they found was not just a story of victimization. It was a story of supreme competence. The 320th hadn't just been there. They had been excellent. They had shot down German planes. They had protected the fleet. They had performed their duties with a proficiency that rivaled any unit in the European theater. The rediscovery of the 320th was like finding a missing piece of a puzzle. Suddenly, the picture of D-Day made sense. It wasn't just a crusade of white knights. It was a messy, diverse, complex American effort, reflecting the messy, diverse, complex reality of the nation itself. But realizing the truth is one thing. Righting the wrong is another. As we move toward the final chapters of this story, we have to confront the present day. We have to look at the belated efforts to award Waverly Woodson his medal. We have to look at the memorials that are finally being built, and we have to ask ourselves, why did it take so long? And what does it say about us that we forgot them in the first place? The story of the 320th is not over. The balloons are gone, but the fight for their legacy, the fight to ensure that no black child ever looks at a D-Day photo and feels excluded from their own history, is happening right now. There is a saying that the first casualty of war is truth. But in the case of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and Waverly Woodson, the truth wasn't killed on the battlefield. It was allowed to die of neglect in a government warehouse. To understand why it took nearly 80 years for this story to resurface, we have to look at one of the most devastating events in the history of American memory. On July 12, 1973, a fire broke out at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. It was a massive, uncontrollable inferno that burned for days. The fire suppression systems failed. The roof collapsed. And in that holocaust of paper and ink, the service records of nearly 18 million Army veterans were incinerated. Among the ashes were the files of the greatest generation. For the Army, this was a logistical nightmare. For the black veterans of World War II, it was a catastrophe that bordered on a conspiracy. For decades, whenever Waverly Woodson or his family asked about the Medal of Honor, the medal that General John C.H. Lee had recommended him for, the medal that everyone who saw him on Omaha Beach knew he deserved, the Army had a simple, impenetrable shield. The records were lost in the fire. It was the ultimate bureaucratic shrug. Without the original piece of paper, without the physical citation signed in 1944, the Army claimed its hands were tied. They couldn't upgrade a medal based on hearsay, even if that hearsay came from generals and eyewitnesses. The fire became the final accomplice in the erasure of the 320th. It provided a convenient smokescreen for a system that had no interest in looking too closely at its own past failures. But while paper burns, memory is fireproof. Waverly Woodson didn't need a file to know what he did. He lived with the pain in his back and groin every day. He lived with the memories of the intestines he had pushed back into dying men's bodies. He raised his children in Maryland, working in a clinical laboratory at the National Institutes of Health, living a life of quiet dignity. He didn't brag. He didn't demand parades. But he told his wife, Joanne, the truth. He told her about the beach. He told her about the balloon winch. He told her about the recommendation that vanished into thin air. In the early 1990s, the United States finally began to grapple with the shameful reality of its awards process. A study commissioned by the Army confirmed what black veterans had known for 50 years. Racism had played a definitive role in the denial of medals of honor during World War II. The study found that despite over 1 million African Americans serving, not a single one had received the nation's highest award for valor during the conflict. It was a statistical impossibility, a mathematical proof of systemic bias. As a result of this study, in 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers. It was a moving, belated ceremony. Only one of the men, Vernon Baker, was still alive to receive it. The others were represented by weeping widows and proud grandchildren. It was a moment of national healing, but in the Woodson household, it was a moment of bittersweet silence. Waverly Woodson was not on that list. Why? Because the investigators couldn't find his file. They found a note, a single tantalizing memorandum from the War Department in 1944 that mentioned a recommendation for the Medal of Honor for a Corporal Woodson. But because the original recommendation itself was gone, likely consumed by the St. Louis fire, the Army refused to act. They admitted he was a hero. They admitted he had been recommended, but they prioritized the bureaucracy of the missing paper over the reality of his heroism. Woodson watched the ceremony on television, happy for his brothers in arms, but acutely aware that the country he had bled for was still hiding behind a technicality. Waverly Woodson died in 2005. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, a hero recognized by his peers, but still denied his due by his government. But his death did not end the fight. It passed the torch to his widow, Joanne. Joanne Woodson became a warrior in her own right. A quiet, determined woman, she refused to let her husband's legacy be defined by a fire in 1973. She kept every scrap of paper he had ever saved. She spoke to journalists. She lobbied politicians. And she found a crucial ally in an investigative journalist named Linda Hervieux. Hervieux was writing a book about the 320th, titled Forgotten. She went where the Army investigators hadn't bothered to look. She dug through dusty archives, not just in St. Louis, but in local libraries, in the attics of veterans' families, and in newspaper microfilms from the 1940s. And she found the smoking gun. She found a document from a War Department aide in 1944 specifically referencing the recommendation of Waverly Woodson for the Medal of Honor. She found a press release issued by the Army itself in August 1944, hailing Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach. The press release described him treating men while submerged in the sea, saving them from drowning, and working for 30 hours despite his own wounds. Think about that. The Army's own public relations department had bragged about his heroism in 1944 to boost morale and show that black troops were contributing. Yet, 60 years later, the Army claimed there was no evidence of his actions sufficient for the Medal of Honor. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. They had used his story when it suited them, then discarded it when it came time to award him the medal that came with a lifetime pension and a salute from every general in the force. Armed with this new evidence, Joanne Woodson and a team of supporters, including Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen, went back to the Pentagon. They argued that the absence of the original document was irrelevant when the Army's own contemporaneous records proved the recommendation existed. They argued that holding a black soldier to a higher standard of proof than white soldiers, whose records were often reconstructed with leniency, was a continuation of the racism of 1944. The Army stonewalled. For years, the review boards came back with the same answer: insufficient evidence. It felt like a cruel game. They were asking a widow to produce a piece of paper that the government itself had burned. It was a Kafkaesque loop designed to exhaust the families until they gave up. But the 320th hadn't given up on Omaha Beach, and their families weren't giving up now. The pressure mounted. A bipartisan coalition of lawmakers introduced legislation to force the president to review the case, bypassing the Army's recalcitrant review boards. The story began to gain traction in the national media. People were outraged. In the era of Black Lives Matter, the story of a black hero denied his medal due to systemic racism resonated with a new generation. Finally, in 2023, the wall cracked, but it didn't break. The Army announced that, based on the review of the new evidence, they would upgrade Waverly Woodson's Bronze Star. But not to the Medal of Honor. They upgraded it to the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. It was a victory, yes. The Distinguished Service Cross is a tremendous honor. It recognized that his actions were far beyond the call of duty. There was a ceremony. There were speeches. Joanne Woodson, now in her 90s, accepted the medal on behalf of her late husband. She held it with dignity, surrounded by cameras. But the elephant in the room was the medal that wasn't there. The decision to award the DSC but deny the Medal of Honor felt to many like a compromise, a way for the Army to say, "We were wrong," without fully admitting the scale of the injustice. It was a half measure. It acknowledged his bravery, but it stopped short of placing him in the pantheon of the absolute greatest heroes of American history. It was a reminder that even in the 21st century, the ghost of Jim Crow still haunts the halls of power. But this story is not just about a medal. The medal is a symbol. The fight for Waverly Woodson is a fight for the 320th, and for every black unit that served in the shadows. It is a fight against the idea that black history is a separate, lesser category of American history. When we look at the legacy of the 320th today, we see the ripple effects of their service in places we might not expect. We see it in the integrated military of today, which, for all its flaws, is one of the most diverse institutions in the country. That integration didn't happen because generals woke up one day and decided to be nice. It happened because men like Woodson forced the issue with their competence. It happened because when President Harry Truman signed the order desegregating the armed forces in 1948, he did so with the reports of the 320th and the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion on his desk. He couldn't justify segregation when the evidence of black valor was staring him in the face. The balloons of the 320th also hover over the modern understanding of logistics and defense. The concept of the barrage balloon seems antiquated now, a relic of a low-tech war, but the principle, using passive defense to deny airspace, is still relevant. More importantly, the logistical miracle of getting those balloons onto the beach is studied as a masterclass in determination. These men hauled tons of equipment through a kill zone without vehicles. They improvised. They adapted. They overcame. They embodied the Ranger motto, "Lead the way," before the Rangers were even a household name. But the most important legacy is the one that resides in the families. The children and grandchildren of the 320th grew up knowing that their patriarchs were giants. They didn't need a movie to tell them. They saw the quiet strength in their father's eyes. They saw the way they carried themselves. They saw the lack of bitterness, replaced by a fierce, burning pride. Joanne Woodson, sitting in her home with the Distinguished Service Cross, knows the truth. She knows that her husband was the best of America, even when America was at its worst. She knows that he saved white men who might have hated him, simply because it was the right thing to do. That is a level of moral courage that transcends a medal. That is the stuff of sainthood. As we move to close this chapter of history, we are left with a question. The balloons are gone from the skies of France. The men are almost all gone from the earth. The records are burned. So, who keeps the story alive? The Army has done its half measure. The history books are slowly being updated. But the real repository of this history is us. It is the people who choose to listen, to share, and to refuse to let the erasure stand. The story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion is a test. It tests our willingness to look at the ugly parts of our past in order to celebrate the beautiful parts. You cannot fully appreciate the heroism of Waverly Woodson without understanding the racism he overcame. You cannot cheer for him on the beach without crying for him on the boat ride home. The two are inseparable. And that complexity is what makes this story so necessary right now. We are living in a time where history is a battleground, where people argue over what should be taught and what should be forgotten. The 320th tells us that we don't have the luxury of forgetting. Because when we forget men like Woodson, we don't just lose a story. We lose a piece of our national soul. We lose the proof that patriotism isn't about blind loyalty to a flag. It's about fighting to make the country represented by that flag worthy of the blood shed to defend it. Waverly Woodson made America worthy. He forced it to be better than it was. And for that, he deserves more than a medal. He deserves to be remembered. He deserves to be a household name, right alongside Eisenhower and Patton and Murphy. The investigation may be officially closed by the Army, but the verdict of history is still open, and the jury is us. To fully grasp the magnitude of what the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion accomplished, we must strip away the modern perception of a balloon. When we hear that word today, we think of birthday parties. We think of harmless rubber toys floating on a string. This linguistic trivialization is another layer of the camouflage that hides the unit's heroism. The VLA, very low altitude, balloons they operated were not toys. They were complex, volatile, industrial machines of war. And operating them required a level of technical proficiency, physical strength, and chemical knowledge that defied every racist stereotype the Army held about black intelligence. Consider the physics of their weapon. These balloons were filled with hydrogen. Hydrogen is the most flammable element in the universe. It is the gas that turned the Hindenburg from an airship into a falling sun in less than 30 seconds. The men of the 320th were essentially carrying bombs on their backs. They had to transport heavy cylinders of this compressed, explosive gas across a beach that was being actively shelled by the enemy. A single piece of hot shrapnel piercing a cylinder, or a stray tracer round hitting a partially inflated bag, would not just pop the balloon. It would incinerate the crew. The Army manual for barrage balloons was thick, technical, and dense. It required calculations of wind speed, drag, cable tension, and winch load. The men had to know how to splice steel cables that were under thousands of pounds of tension, a task where a mistake could snap a man in half or sever a limb. They had to maintain sensitive winch engines in an environment filled with sand and salt water. They had to coordinate the altitude of their balloons to create a seamless net, working in perfect synchronization with other crews while deafened by artillery. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The Army assigned black troops to this unit in part because they viewed it as a service role, distinct from the glory of the infantry. But the men of the 320th transformed a support role into a showcase of elite technical skill. They mastered the chemistry. They mastered the mechanics. They mastered the aerodynamics. They proved that the minds of black men were just as sharp, just as capable of handling complex military technology as the minds of the white officers who looked down on them. They were not just laborers dragging ropes. They were combat engineers operating a high-tech aerial defense system in the middle of a kill zone. And while Waverly Woodson is the face of their heroism, he was not the only hero. We must speak the name of William Dabney. Dabney was a corporal in the 320th, a 19-year-old from Roanoke, Virginia. Like Woodson, he hit Omaha Beach in the first wave. Like Woodson, he found himself in hell. As he dragged his balloon ashore, a German shell struck the LCT next to him, vaporizing the men inside. Dabney didn't freeze. He and his crew hauled their balloon across the shingle, dug in, and got their bird in the air. Dabney survived the war. He came home to a country that treated him like a second-class citizen, but unlike many others, he lived long enough to see the cracks in the wall of silence. In 2009, 65 years after he stormed the beach, the French government did what the American government had struggled to do. They awarded William Dabney the Legion of Honor, France's highest decoration. Picture the scene. An old man, his hair white, his back slightly stooped, standing on American soil. A French diplomat pins a medal to his chest and kisses him on both cheeks. The Frenchman speaks of liberté, égalité, fraternité. He speaks of a debt that France can never repay. It was a moment of profound validation, but it was also a moment of stinging irony. It took a foreign government, the government of the land he liberated, to fully recognize his status as a warrior hero. The United States had given him a Good Conduct Medal. France gave him knighthood. Dabney's story, like Woodson's, highlights the disconnect between the reality of the war and the memory of the war. When Dabney returned to Roanoke in 1945, he couldn't get a job in the industries that were booming. He ended up working as a construction laborer and a janitor. Think about the waste of human potential. Here was a man who had successfully managed complex logistics under enemy fire, a man who had demonstrated leadership and technical acumen in the chaos of D-Day. And America looked at him and said, "Here is a broom." How many businesses were never built? How many inventions were never made? How many communities were kept in poverty because men like William Dabney were denied the opportunity to use the skills they had forged in war? The racism of the era wasn't just a moral sin, it was an act of national self-sabotage. The 320th also forces us to confront the myth of the unwilling black soldier. There was a pervasive belief among white commanders that black troops would not fight unless forced. But the history of the 320th contradicts this at every turn. These men volunteered for the Barrage Balloon Service. They knew it was dangerous. They knew they would be targets. And when the time came, they didn't just do their jobs. They went above and beyond. There are reports from the hedgerows of Normandy where 320th crews, after securing their balloons, picked up rifles and hunted German snipers who were harassing the supply lines. They weren't ordered to do this. They did it because they were soldiers, and they were tired of taking fire. They integrated themselves into the fight. In one instance, a group of 320th men captured a group of German soldiers who had surrendered. The Germans were shocked. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that black men were savages, monkeys with tails. Instead, they were captured by disciplined, uniformed, professional Americans who treated them according to the Geneva Convention, often better than those black soldiers were treated by their own countrymen in Mississippi. This interaction, the black soldier confronting the Nazi Superman, is one of the most powerful tableaus of the war. It exposed the lie of racial supremacy in the most direct way possible. The Nazis claimed to be the master race. The Americans claimed to be the arsenal of democracy while practicing segregation. And standing in the middle, exposing the hypocrisy of both, was the black soldier. By defeating the Germans, they proved the Nazis wrong. By doing it with dignity and excellence, they proved white America wrong. They were the ultimate iconoclasts, smashing the idols of racism with every step they took toward Berlin. As the 320th moved deeper into Europe, supporting the breakout from Normandy and the liberation of Holland, they became part of a larger tapestry of black service that is often overlooked. They were the brothers of the Tuskegee Airmen in the sky. They were the cousins of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, who were tearing up the German armor in the Battle of the Bulge. They were the counterparts to the Red Ball Express, the mostly black trucking units that performed logistical miracles to keep Patton's tanks fueled. When you look at the war through this lens, the narrative shifts. It stops being a story of white heroes saving the world with black people in the background washing dishes. It becomes a story of a diverse nation, struggling with its own soul, yet somehow managing to come together to defeat a great evil. The 320th was the glue. They protected the beaches so the infantry could land. They protected the ports so the Red Ball Express could load up. They protected the artillery, so the 761st could advance. They were the shield that allowed the sword to strike. Without them, the invasion arguably fails. Without them, the airspace over Omaha is a shooting gallery for the Luftwaffe. Yet, for decades, the surviving members of the unit gathered in small reunions, largely ignored by the press. They brought out their photo albums, the black and white snapshots of smiling young men in helmets, standing in front of their silver balloons in the fields of France. They told the old stories. They laughed about the terrible food. They cried for the men who didn't come back. And they wondered why their country seemed so intent on forgetting them. They didn't realize that their very existence was a threat to the established order. To acknowledge the 320th was to acknowledge that black men were essential to the victory. And if they were essential to the victory, they were entitled to the spoils. The housing, the education, the voting rights, the respect. Acknowledging them meant dismantling Jim Crow. So, the silence was a political weapon. It was a dam built to hold back the floodwaters of equality. But dams eventually break. The pressure of the truth is too great. As the veterans aged, as their numbers dwindled from hundreds to dozens to a handful, a sense of urgency took hold of their families. They realized that if they didn't tell the story, no one would. They began to record the oral histories. They began to donate the uniforms and the medals to museums. They began to contact authors and filmmakers. They became the archivists of their own glory. This grassroots effort is what saved the 320th from total oblivion. It wasn't the government that initiated the recovery of this history. It was the people. It was the daughters who found the letters in the shoebox. It was the grandsons who Googled the unit patch they found in a drawer. It was the community refusing to let the light go out. And now, as we stand in the 21st century, the balloons are rising again, not in the sky, but in our collective consciousness. We are finally seeing the war in full color. We are seeing the sweat on the faces of the winch operators. We are feeling the fear of the medics on the sand. We are understanding that the greatest generation was great, not because it was flawless, but because it contained men like Waverly Woodson and William Dabney. Men who loved their country enough to fight for it, even when it didn't love them back. Their legacy is not just in the past. It is a challenge to the present. It asks us, who are we overlooking today? Whose contributions are being erased because they don't fit the dominant narrative? Who are the essential workers, the protectors, the healers who are being treated as second-class citizens? The story of the 320th is a lens that sharpens our vision of justice. It teaches us to look for the heroes in the margins, to question the official story, and to understand that true patriotism is often found in the acts of those who have the most reason to turn their backs on their country, but choose to serve it anyway. As we prepare for the final chapter of this saga, we must hold onto this image. A black soldier on a beach in France, holding a cable that connects the earth to the sky. He is grounded in the mud of reality, but he is looking up. He is holding the line. He is protecting us all. And it is high time we looked up and saw him. We have to talk about Steven Spielberg. We have to talk about Saving Private Ryan. When that film was released in 1998, it was hailed as the definitive cinematic portrayal of combat. The opening 20 minutes, depicting the landing at Omaha Beach, are visceral, terrifying, and technically masterful. They changed the way war movies were made forever. But they also solidified a lie. In those 20 minutes of shaking cameras and flying gore, amidst the thousands of extras and the millions of dollars spent on historical accuracy, there is not a single black face. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion is missing. The barrage balloons themselves, those massive silver sentinels that define the skyline of D-Day, are largely absent or relegated to the deep background, stripped of the men who operated them. This is not to attack a movie, but to illustrate a crisis of memory. When pop culture erases a group of people, it does something far more damaging than a history book with a missing chapter. It creates a visual reality. For millions of Americans, and indeed for people around the world, the reality of D-Day is what they saw on that screen. It is a reality of white heroism, white sacrifice, and white victory. The absence of the 320th in our cultural imagination reinforces the subtle, insidious idea that black people were passengers in American history, not drivers. It suggests that they were given freedom, not that they fought and died to secure it for everyone. This cultural amnesia has real-world consequences. It affects how black veterans are treated at the VA. It affects how black children see themselves in the classroom. When a young black boy learns about W. Weiss and sees only white faces storming the beaches, he internalizes a message of exclusion. He is told, without words, "This was not your fight. This is not your glory." The story of the 320th is the antidote to that poison. It puts the black soldier back in the frame, not as a token, but as an essential element of the victory. It tells that boy, "You were there. You held the sky." But correcting the record is a grind. It is a fight against inertia. In the years following the war, the Army's own history books mentioned the 320th only in passing, often burying their contributions in statistical tables about colored personnel. The narrative was controlled by men who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. To admit that black troops performed heroically in 1944 would have been to admit that the segregation of 1950 was morally bankrupt. So, the silence was strategic. It took outsiders to break that silence. It took journalists like Linda Hervieux, who spent years tracking down the families of the 320th, digging through attics for letters and photos, piecing together the roster of a unit that the Army seemed to have forgotten. When her book Forgotten was published, it was a revelation. It didn't just tell a story. It provided the receipts. It showed the photos of the men on the beach. It quoted the diaries. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the erasure was a lie. This sparked a new phase in the battle for Waverly Woodson's Medal of Honor. It wasn't just a family grievance anymore. It was a cause célèbre. In 2019 and 2020, as America grappled with a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, the story of the 320th gained new resonance. A bipartisan group of lawmakers, led by Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, took up the torch. They introduced legislation specifically designed to force the Pentagon to review Woodson's case. They argued that the lost files excuse was no longer tenable in the face of the overwhelming circumstantial evidence Hervieux and the family had uncovered. The Army's resistance during this period was baffling to many. Why fight it? Why not just give the medal? It would cost the Army nothing and gain them an immense amount of goodwill. It would be a powerful symbol of progress. But institutions are slow to admit fault. To award the Medal of Honor now would be to admit that the Army of the 1940s was explicitly racist, a fact everyone knows, but one the institution hates to formalize in writing regarding specific cases. It would open the door to hundreds of other reviews. It would force a re-examination of the entire awards process. So, they dug in. They cited regulations. They demanded a primary document, the original recommendation signed by a general, knowing full well that document had been burned in 1973. It was a catch-22 of the highest order. We can't give you the medal because we lost the paper that proves you deserve the medal. To Joanne Woodson, Waverly's widow, this felt like a final, bureaucratic insult. She was an elderly woman fighting the most powerful military on earth, armed only with the truth and a scrapbook of her husband's memories. But she didn't waver. In interviews, she spoke with a quiet, steely grace. "He earned it," she would say. America owes it to him. She wasn't asking for a favor. She was demanding payment on a debt. While the Pentagon dragged its feet, the court of public opinion delivered its own verdict. Memorials began to spring up. In 2022, a plaque was dedicated on Omaha Beach honoring the 320th. Think about that. For nearly 80 years, millions of tourists had walked that sand without knowing. Now, there was a marker, a physical anchor for the memory. Black veterans groups organized pilgrimages to the site. They stood where Woodson stood. They poured libations into the sand. They reclaimed the ground. The legacy of the 320th also began to permeate the modern military. Today, the U.S. military is one of the most diverse institutions in the world. Black generals command armies. A black man, Lloyd Austin, serves as Secretary of Defense. These leaders stand on the shoulders of the 320th. When General Austin speaks about the history of the force, he knows that his path was paved by men who were forced to sit in the back of the mess hall. The integration of the military in 1948 by Harry Truman was the direct result of the performance of units like the 320th. They made the argument for segregation militarily unsustainable. You cannot segregate competence. You cannot segregate courage. Once the genie was out of the bottle, once the world saw what black troops could do, the old order was doomed. But we must be careful not to view this as a simple, happy ending. The integration of the military did not end racism in the ranks, just as the Civil War did not end racism in America. It merely changed the battlefield. The struggle of the 320th is a reminder that progress is not a straight line. It is a jagged, uphill climb, full of setbacks and resistance. The fact that we are still fighting for Woodson's medal in the 2020s proves that the work is not done. It proves that the system is still protecting its own historical narrative, still reluctant to fully cede the high ground of heroism to a black man from Philadelphia. Let's look closely at the what if. What if Waverly Woodson had been white? Let's be honest. If a white medic from Iowa had landed with the first wave, wounded, saved drowning men, treated 200 casualties, and worked for 30 hours until he collapsed, he would have been on the cover of Life magazine within a month. He would have been on a war bond tour. He would have been played by a movie star in the 1950s. His name would be on elementary schools. The disparity is not subtle. It is glaring, and it forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that American heroism has always been graded on a curve. The 320th challenges us to flatten that curve. It challenges us to look at the past with clear eyes. It asks us to celebrate the greatest generation, not as a monolithic block of white virtue, but as a complex, flawed, and incredibly diverse group of people who saved the world despite their country's sins. The men of the 320th were patriots in the deepest, most difficult sense of the word. They loved America not for what it was, but for what it could be. They fought for the idea of America, even while the reality of America was spitting in their faces. As we approach the final movements of this story, we have to look at the passing of the torch. The last member of the 320th, Henry Parham, passed away in 2021. He was 99 years old. With his death, the living memory of the unit was extinguished. There is no one left to say, "I was there." There is no one left to recount the sound of the winches or the smell of the hydrogen. We have moved from the era of memory to the era of history. This transition is dangerous. When the witnesses die, the revisionists move in. It becomes easier to forget, easier to smooth over the rough edges, easier to slide back into the comfortable myths. That is why this story, right now, right here, is so critical. We are the new custodians. It is up to us to ensure that when Henry Parham and Waverly Woodson and William Dabney died, their truth didn't die with them. We have to become the winches. We have to tether this history to the ground so it doesn't float away. We have to hold the line against the erasure. The Army may have closed the file, but we can open it every single day. We can tell the story to our children. We can share it on social media. We can demand that the textbooks be rewritten. The battle for Omaha Beach ended in 1944. The battle for the memory of Omaha Beach is happening now. And the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion is leading the charge, calling out from the past, demanding that we see them. They are asking us a simple question. We did our part. Will you do yours? The Distinguished Service Cross awarded to Woodson in 2023 was a step. It was an admission of guilt by the Army, a crack in the dam. But it was not the full measure of justice. It was a compromise. And if there is one thing the 320th taught us, it is that you do not compromise with gravity. You do not compromise with the enemy, and you do not compromise with the truth. They aimed for the sky. We should aim for nothing less than the Medal of Honor, because anything less is a lie, and we are done with lies.